I'm Judith Brooks, 28 years old, and 6 months ago, something happened at my brother's anniversary party that changed everything between us forever. I discovered he had been planning to drug me, but when I switched our drinks at the last second, his own wife ended up being the victim instead. But what my family did when they found out was even worse. If you've ever felt like the black sheep in your own family, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this type of betrayal. The story starts 7 years ago when I first met David at a coffee shop in downtown Portland. I was 21, fresh out of college with my marketing degree, nervously fidgeting with my portfolio before my first real job interview. The espresso machine was broken, leaving only drip coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard, and I was already running late. David was sitting at the corner table by the window, wearing a navy button-down that brought out his eyes, sketching architectural plans on graph paper. When I accidentally knocked over the sugar dispenser rushing past his table, sending white crystals everywhere, he looked up and smiled. "Nervous about something?" he asked, and something about his calm voice made my shoulders relax for the first time all morning. We talked for 20 minutes about everything except what I was nervous about. He told me about the sustainable housing project he was designing, his hands moving expressively as he described solar panels and rainwater collection systems. I found myself leaning closer, drawn to his passion for creating something meaningful. When I finally had to leave, he scribbled his number on a napkin and said, "Text me how the interview goes. I have a feeling you're going to nail it." I did nail it, and I texted him that evening from my tiny studio apartment, sitting cross-legged on my futon with Chinese takeout and a bottle of $2 wine. That text turned into a 3-hour phone conversation that ended with plans for dinner the next Friday. Our first date lasted 11 hours. We met at Pike Place Market at 2 in the afternoon, planning to grab lunch and walk around. David showed up in jeans and a gray sweater, carrying a reusable coffee cup and a canvas bag, details that seemed small then but showed me who he was. We wandered through the fish market, where he bought us steamed clams and crusty bread, then walked down to the waterfront. The conversation flowed like we'd known each other for years. He told me about growing up in a small town in Montana, how his dad taught him to build things with his hands, and how he'd saved for 3 years to move to Portland and start his architecture practice. I shared stories about my chaotic childhood with 3 siblings, how I'd learned to mediate conflicts before I learned to drive, and my dream of running my own marketing agency someday. As the sun set over Elliott Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, we found ourselves at a little jazz club in Pioneer Square. The music was mellow, the lighting dim, and David asked me to dance even though there wasn't really a dance floor. We swayed to Miles Davis, his hand warm on my lower back, and I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just attraction or infatuation, this was the feeling of finding someone who saw the world the same way I did. When he walked me to my car at 1 in the morning, he kissed me gently against the driver's side door, tasting like the mint tea we'd shared at the club. "I'd like to see you again," he whispered against my forehead, and I knew I was already falling. The next 5 years felt like building a life in fast forward, each milestone happening naturally and joyfully. David's architecture practice grew from a one-man operation in a shared workspace to a team of 6 in a converted warehouse in the Pearl District. I started at an entry-level position at a marketing firm but quickly proved myself, landing bigger clients and more creative campaigns. We moved in together after 8 months into a craftsman-style duplex with hardwood floors and a kitchen window that caught the morning light perfectly. David would wake up early to make coffee in our French press, always Colombian beans from the roastery down the street, and I'd stumble out in my pajamas to find him reading the news on his tablet, steam rising from 2 mismatched mugs he'd set on the counter. Sunday mornings became our sacred time, farmers' market runs where we'd buy whatever vegetables looked best, then come home to cook elaborate brunches while jazz played from the vintage radio he'd restored. He taught me to make perfect scrambled eggs, low and slow with real butter, while I introduced him to my grandmother's pancake recipe that required whipping the egg whites separately. Our friends started calling us the power couple, not because we were flashy or wealthy, but because we seemed to have figured out how to be genuinely happy together. When my marketing firm offered me a promotion that would require relocating to Seattle, David didn't hesitate. Portland, Seattle, Mars, wherever you go, I go, he said, already researching architecture firms in Washington. We spent 3 months planning the move, finding a one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill with exposed brick walls and a Murphy bed that David promised to replace with something more permanent once we settled in. Seattle became our proving ground in the best possible way. David landed a position at a firm specializing in eco-friendly urban development, working on projects that aligned perfectly with his values. I threw myself into my new role as senior marketing manager, managing campaigns for tech startups and sustainable fashion brands. We discovered new favorite spots: the bookstore cafe where we'd spend Saturday afternoons reading in companionable silence, the hiking trail that led to a waterfall where we'd pack sandwiches and plan our future, the dive bar near our apartment that served the best fish and chips in the city. David proposed on a rainy Thursday evening in November, not at a fancy restaurant or scenic overlook, but in our tiny kitchen while I was making his grandmother's beef stew recipe. He got down on one knee right there on the checkered linoleum, holding a simple platinum band with a small, perfectly clear diamond. "Judith," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "you make everything better just by being in it. Will you marry me?" I said yes before he even finished the question, and we spent the rest of the evening calling our families and friends, sharing leftover stew and cheap champagne while rain pelted the windows. The ring fit perfectly because he'd secretly measured one of my other rings months earlier, a detail that made me cry happy tears all over again. We set the date for the following September, planning a small ceremony in my parents' backyard in Oregon with close family and friends, but even in those golden years, there were tiny cracks I chose to ignore, hairline fractures in my family relationships that should have warned me what was coming. My older brother Marius had always been the golden child, charismatic, successful in real estate, married to Jennifer, a perfectly polished woman who wore designer clothes and posted Instagram photos of their elaborate dinner parties. During family gatherings, Marius would make subtle comments about David's modest income as an architect, or suggest that I was settling for a simpler life than I deserved. "You're so smart, Judith," he'd say with that condescending smile. "I just wonder if you're thinking big enough." My parents Linda and Robert had always favored Marius in ways that were obvious to everyone except them. When he bought his first house, they threw him a housewarming party and invited the whole extended family. When David and I moved to Seattle, they sent a congratulations card. When Marius got a promotion, my dad posted about it on Facebook with 3 paragraphs about his successful son. When I landed my dream job, my mom mentioned it briefly during our weekly phone call. I told myself it didn't matter, that David and I had built something real and meaningful that didn't need external validation. But deep down, those small slights accumulated like sediment, creating a foundation of hurt I didn't want to acknowledge. The morning of Marius and Jennifer's 5th anniversary party started like any other Saturday in March. David and I woke up in our new apartment. We'd finally upgraded to a 2-bedroom place in Fremont with a garden view and space for David's drafting table. I made coffee while he showered, the familiar ritual of measuring beans and timing the pour-over, giving me something to focus on besides my anxiety about seeing my family. The party was being held at their house in Lake Oswego, a sprawling contemporary structure with floor-to-ceiling windows and a kitchen that belonged in a magazine. Jennifer had been planning it for months, sending detailed emails about the dress code, cocktail attire, the menu, farm to table with wine pairings, and the schedule: arrival at 6, dinner at 7:30, dancing until midnight. I'd bought a new dress for the occasion, a midnight blue wrap dress that David said made my eyes look like dark chocolate, and spent 40 minutes on my makeup trying to look like I belonged in Jennifer's perfectly curated world. David wore his best charcoal suit with the tie I'd given him for Christmas, and we looked good together, like we could hold our own among my family's carefully constructed success narrative. The drive down to Portland took 3 hours, and we filled the time with our usual road trip playlist and easy conversation. David had brought his latest project plans to show my dad, hoping to connect over their shared interest in construction and design. I'd prepared myself mentally for the usual family dynamics: Marius's subtle superiority, Jennifer's backhanded compliments, my parents' obvious favoritism, but I felt ready to handle it all with David by my side. We stopped for gas in Centralia and bought those terrible convenience store sandwiches that somehow taste amazing when you're traveling, eating them in the car while watching other travelers come and go. You know what I love about us, David said, mayo from his turkey sandwich on his chin. We can make anything fun. I leaned over to wipe his face with a napkin, kissing him softly, tasting the strange combination of processed meat and love. We were genuinely happy, genuinely in love, and I thought that would be enough to shield us from whatever family drama might unfold. We arrived at Marius and Jennifer's house at exactly 6 o'clock, finding the circular driveway already packed with luxury cars, BMWs, Audis, a Tesla, and Marius's pride and joy, a silver Porsche 911 that he detailed every weekend. The house looked like something from a design magazine, all clean lines and expensive landscaping, with soft lighting that made everything glow. Jennifer answered the door in a cream-colored cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her blonde hair perfectly styled in loose waves. "Judith, David, you made it," she exclaimed, air-kissing both our cheeks and leaving a faint trace of Chanel No. 5 in her wake. "You look absolutely stunning, that dress is so cute, very affordable chic." The comment hit exactly as intended, a compliment wrapped around an insult, delivered with such sweetness that calling it out would make me look petty. David's hand tightened slightly on my lower back, a silent signal that he'd heard it too and was right there with me. Marius appeared behind Jennifer wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, little sister!" "And David, good to see you, buddy." The handshake they exchanged lasted a beat too long, Marius's grip slightly too firm, a miniature dominance display that made my stomach clench. The party was exactly what I'd expected. 30 of their closest friends and family members mingling in rooms that looked like furniture showroom displays, drinking wine that cost more per bottle than most people spend on groceries in a week. I recognized some faces from previous gatherings, Jennifer's sorority sisters who all looked like VJ-editions of the same person, Marius's golf buddies who worked in finance and talked loudly about market trends, and scattered family members who seemed more interested in the free alcohol than actual conversation. My parents were holding court near the kitchen island, my father deep in conversation with Marius about a commercial property development, my mother admiring Jennifer's new backsplash with appropriate enthusiasm. "Judith, honey," my mom called when she spotted us, wrapping me in a brief hug that smelled like her signature perfume and white wine. "You look lovely. How's work going? Still doing that marketing thing?" The dismissive way she said that marketing thing about my career, the same career that had earned me 3 promotions in 2 years, made David shift uncomfortably beside me. My father shook David's hand with genuine warmth, at least, asking about his latest projects and actually listening to the answers. The evening progressed predictably through appetizers that were more art than food, conversations that skated across the surface of real connection, and multiple trips to refill wine glasses from bottles that Jennifer announced with pride. "This is a 2018 Burgundy from a vineyard we discovered on our trip to France," she'd say, pouring generous glasses while describing the notes of black cherry and minerality that really complement the salmon. I found myself drinking more than usual, partly from nerves and partly because the wine actually was exceptional. David stayed close to my side, occasionally catching my eye and making subtle faces that reminded me we were a team navigating this together. Around 8:30, after dinner had been served and cleared, Marius stood up to give a toast. "5 years ago," he began, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room, "I married the most incredible woman I've ever met. Jennifer has made me a better man, a better businessman, and honestly, a better person in every way." The guests murmured appreciative sounds while Jennifer beamed, her hand resting on Marius's arm in a gesture that looked practiced and perfect. "But tonight isn't just about celebrating our marriage," Marius continued, his eyes finding mine across the room. "It's about celebrating family and how the people we love shape who we become." Something in his tone made my skin prickle with unease, a predatory undertone that didn't match his words. Jennifer excused herself to check on dessert preparations, and I watched Marius's eyes follow her movement before returning to scan the room, like he was calculating something. The party continued around us, conversations resuming and glasses being refilled, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface. David was talking to my cousin Sarah about her new job in graphic design, but I found myself studying Marius's face, trying to read the expression that flickered there when he thought no one was watching. When Jennifer returned from the kitchen carrying a tray of individual chocolate tarts topped with gold leaf, Marius moved to help her, his hand brushing her lower back in a gesture that looked loving but felt somehow performative. "Dessert is served," Jennifer announced, "and I've prepared something special to go with it." She began setting small glasses filled with a pale pink liquid on the coffee table, each one garnished with a fresh raspberry. "It's a elderflower and prosecco cocktail," she explained. "The recipe is from this amazing mixologist in Paris." The drinks looked beautiful and innocent, like something you'd order at a high-end brunch spot, but as Marius handed me one of the glasses, I caught a whiff of something that didn't belong, a sharp chemical smell hidden beneath the floral sweetness of elderflower. I held the glass without drinking, watching as others began sipping their cocktails and complimenting Jennifer's creativity. David took a small taste of his and nodded appreciatively, but I noticed Marius hadn't touched his own drink. Instead, he was watching me with an intensity that made my stomach flip. "Not thirsty, Judith?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes locked on mine. "Jennifer worked really hard on these. It would be a shame not to try it." The pressure in his voice was subtle but unmistakable, and suddenly the chemical smell seemed stronger, more acrid. I looked around the room and realized that Jennifer hadn't taken a glass either. She was bustling around, playing hostess, but avoiding the very cocktail she'd supposedly created. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity, the way Marius had been watching me all evening, the strange undercurrent in his anniversary toast, the fact that both he and Jennifer were avoiding their own drinks. This wasn't a celebration cocktail, this was something else entirely. My hand trembling slightly, I raised the glass to my lips but didn't drink, buying myself time to think. What could I do? If I confronted Marius directly, he'd deny everything and I'd look paranoid and crazy. If I simply didn't drink it, he'd push harder, maybe even get physical. And if I was right about what was in that glass, drinking it could put me in serious danger. I caught David's eye and tried to communicate silently that something was wrong, but he was engaged in conversation with my aunt and didn't pick up on my distress. The room felt like it was tilting slightly, whether from the wine I'd already consumed or pure panic, I couldn't tell. Marius was still watching me, his smile growing more strained as I continued to hold the untouched glass. "You know," I said finally, loud enough for several people to hear, "this looks absolutely delicious, Jennifer. Actually, would you mind if I switched with you? I saw you didn't grab one yet, and I'd love for you to have the first taste of your own creation." I held out my glass toward her before she could protest, my heart hammering so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Jennifer's face went through a series of micro-expressions, confusion, alarm, and then something that looked almost like relief. "Oh, that's so sweet of you, Judith, but I couldn't," she started, but I was already moving toward her, glass extended. "I insist," I said firmly, loud enough that several nearby guests turned to watch the exchange. "The hostess should definitely get the first taste." Marius stepped forward quickly. "Actually, Judith, that's Jennifer's special recipe. She made it specifically for our guests, so you should really—" But I was done being polite. "And I think it's only right that she gets to enjoy her own handiwork," I interrupted, still holding the glass out to Jennifer. The room had gone quiet enough that several conversations stopped, people sensing tension without understanding its source. Jennifer looked trapped, her eyes darting between me, Marius, and the glass in my outstretched hand. She reached for it with visibly shaking fingers, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I'd been right. Whatever was in that glass, Marius had intended it for me, and Jennifer knew exactly what it was. Jennifer brought the glass to her lips and took a small, reluctant sip. Within minutes, her behavior began to change in ways that made my blood run cold. The confident hostess who'd been gracefully managing a room full of guests started to sway slightly on her feet, her words becoming slurred when she tried to respond to questions. I think I need to sit down," she mumbled, one hand reaching for the wall to steady herself. Marius immediately moved to her side, playing the concerned husband perfectly. "Honey, are you feeling all right? You've been working so hard on this party, maybe you're just exhausted." But I could see the panic in his eyes as he looked at his wife's deteriorating condition, the realization that his plan had backfired in the worst possible way. Other guests started to notice something was wrong as Jennifer stumbled toward the couch, her coordination clearly impaired despite having consumed very little alcohol throughout the evening. "Should we call someone?" my aunt asked, genuine concern in her voice. "Maybe she needs some water or fresh air?" David appeared at my side, his hand finding mine automatically. "What's happening?" he whispered, and I squeezed his fingers tightly, not trusting myself to speak without my voice shaking. Across the room, Marius was helping Jennifer to the couch, his face a mask of concern that didn't quite hide the guilt and fear underneath. "She must be having some kind of reaction," he announced to the room. "Maybe she's allergic to something in the cocktail ingredients." The lie was smooth and believable, delivered with just the right amount of worry and confusion. But I saw the way his hands shook as he loosened Jennifer's cardigan, the way he avoided making eye contact with anyone for more than a few seconds. Jennifer was trying to speak but couldn't form coherent words, her head lolling back against the couch cushions in a way that made several guests exchange worried glances. "We should definitely call 911, my mother said, pulling out her phone. "This doesn't look like a simple allergic reaction." That's when Marius made his first critical mistake. Instead of supporting the idea of calling emergency services, he tried to discourage it. "Let's not overreact," he said quickly. "I think she just needs to rest. Maybe everyone should head home and give her some space to recover." The suggestion was so inappropriate, asking guests to leave while his wife was clearly in medical distress, that even the most socially oblivious person in the room could tell something was off. David's grip on my hand tightened, and I knew he was putting together the same pieces I had earlier. "Marius," my father said firmly, "your wife needs medical attention. This isn't something you handle by having everyone leave." But Marius doubled down, his panic making him increasingly irrational. "She's fine, she just needs to sleep it off. Too much excitement, too much wine. You know how women can be at parties." The casual sexism of the comment, combined with his bizarre resistance to getting help for Jennifer, started turning the room against him. I watched this unfold with a mixture of horror and vindication. Horror because Jennifer, whatever her flaws, didn't deserve what was happening to her. Vindication because Marius's true nature was finally being revealed to an audience that included our parents, his friends, and his professional colleagues. When my cousin finally ignored Marius's protests and called 911, he actually tried to take the phone away from her. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, his careful facade cracking completely. "You're all overreacting to what's obviously just too much alcohol." But Jennifer hadn't had too much alcohol. I'd been watching her all evening, and she'd nursed the same glass of wine for over an hour. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, and as they began assessing Jennifer's condition, asking pointed questions about what she'd consumed and when, Marius's story started falling apart. When they found traces of what was clearly not elderflower or prosecco in the remaining cocktail glasses, the evening took on an entirely different tone. The next few hours blurred together in a haze of police interviews, medical questions, and family confrontations that would shatter our relationships forever. Jennifer was taken to the hospital, where tests confirmed she'd been drugged with a potent sedative that could have been life-threatening if she'd consumed more of it. The police questioned everyone at the party, but their focus quickly centered on Marius when multiple witnesses confirmed his strange behavior around the cocktails and his resistance to getting medical help. I gave my statement truthfully, explaining exactly what I'd observed and why I'd insisted on switching drinks. When the detective asked me directly if I believed my brother had intended to drug me, I felt sick saying it out loud, but I couldn't lie. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think he put something in that drink meant for me, and I think his wife accidentally became the victim of his plan." The family's reaction to these revelations was almost worse than Marius's betrayal itself. Instead of horror at what their son had attempted to do to me, my parents immediately went into damage control mode, focused entirely on protecting Marius's reputation and minimizing the scandal. "There has to be some explanation," my mother kept saying, as if repetition could make the evidence disappear. "Marius would never hurt anyone, especially not his own sister." My father was more direct in his denial. "You're destroying this family with these accusations, Judith. Your brother made a mistake. Maybe he was drinking too much, but this idea that he was trying to hurt you is ridiculous." When I pointed out that the physical evidence supported my account, the drugged cocktails, Marius's behavior, Jennifer's condition, they dismissed it as circumstantial. You switched the drinks, my father said accusingly. How do we know you didn't put something in them yourself, and then switch them to frame Marius? The suggestion that I had drugged Jennifer to frame my brother was so outrageous, so completely divorced from reality, that I almost laughed. Almost, if it hadn't been coming from my own father, if it hadn't represented such a fundamental betrayal of trust and love, it might have been funny. Instead, it was devastating. David was furious on my behalf, stepping forward to defend me when I couldn't find words to respond to such an accusation. Are you seriously suggesting that Judith drugged someone to frame her brother? He asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Do you hear how insane that sounds? But my parents had already chosen their side, and it wasn't mine. They were prepared to believe any alternative narrative that painted Marius as the victim rather than accept that their golden child had attempted to assault his own sister. The family that I'd hoped would protect me was instead closing ranks against me, treating me like the threat that needed to be contained. 3 days after the anniversary party, Marius was arrested and charged with assault and attempted sexual assault. The news hit our extended family and social circle like a bomb, spreading through whispered phone calls and social media posts that tried to make sense of what had happened. Jennifer filed for divorce immediately, her lawyer releasing a statement saying she was shocked and horrified by her husband's actions and was cooperating fully with the investigation. She moved out of their shared house within a week, staying with her sister while she figured out how to rebuild her life. I felt terrible for her, despite our complicated relationship. She'd been as much a victim of Marius's plan as I would have been, maybe more so because she'd trusted him completely. When she called me a few days after his arrest, her voice was small and broken. I'm so sorry, Judith, she whispered through tears. I had no idea what he was planning. If I had known, she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. We both knew that if she'd known, she would have stopped it. Meanwhile, my parents doubled down on their support for Marius, hiring an expensive criminal defense attorney and telling anyone who would listen that the charges were based on misunderstandings and family drama. They started a campaign to undermine my credibility, sharing selective details about my past that painted me as unstable or vengeful. They told people about the time in college when I'd struggled with anxiety and needed therapy, suggesting it proved I was prone to dramatic interpretations of normal situations. They brought up every argument Marius and I had ever had, every moment of sibling rivalry, as evidence that I was motivated by jealousy rather than truth. Judith has always resented Marius's success, my mother told my aunt, knowing the comment would make its way back to me. This is just her way of tearing him down because she can't stand that he's done better than her. The character assassination was systematic and cruel, designed to isolate me from the family and community support I needed most. Some of my extended family bought into it, choosing to believe the simpler narrative that painted this as a sibling dispute rather than attempted assault. Others stayed neutral, which felt almost as bad as outright hostility. Only a few relatives reached out to offer support, including my grandmother, who called me the day after Marius's arrest. I believe you, she said simply. I've seen how that boy treats people when he thinks no one is watching, and I'm not surprised it came to this. Your parents are blinded by their favoritism, but that doesn't make you wrong. Her support meant everything to me in those dark weeks when it felt like my entire family had turned against me. The legal process dragged on for months, each court appearance requiring me to relive the trauma and face my parents' continued hostility. They attended every hearing, sitting directly behind Marius's table in a show of solidarity that felt like a slap in the face. David came with me to every single one, taking time off work and holding my hand through testimony that was painful and humiliating to give. The defense attorney tried to paint me as a troubled sister seeking revenge, questioning my mental health history and suggesting I had manufactured the entire scenario to hurt Marius. But the physical evidence was overwhelming: the drugs in the cocktail glasses, the witnesses who saw Marius's strange behavior, Jennifer's medical records showing clear signs of having been drugged. When the toxicology report came back showing the same substance in both the remaining cocktails and in Jennifer's system, even Marius's expensive lawyer couldn't explain it away. The trial lasted 2 weeks, during which our family's dysfunction was exposed to public scrutiny in the most painful way possible. Local news outlets picked up the story, running headlines about the prominent real estate professional accused of drugging his sister at a family party. Marius's colleagues distanced themselves from him, his business partnerships dissolved, and his carefully constructed reputation crumbled. Jennifer testified against him, describing how she'd noticed him acting strangely around the cocktails but hadn't understood what she was seeing until it was too late. Her testimony was devastating, delivered with quiet dignity that made Marius's attempts to discredit her look even more pathetic. When the jury returned a guilty verdict on all charges, I felt relief mixed with grief. Justice had been served, but my family was destroyed beyond repair. The sentencing hearing was where my parents finally crossed the line from disappointing to unforgivable. Given the opportunity to make a statement before Marius was sentenced, they chose to use their time to attack me rather than acknowledge his crimes. "Our daughter has destroyed our family," my mother said, her voice shaking with emotion. "She has torn apart our lives with these accusations, and we will never forgive her for what she's done to our son." My father was even more direct. "Marius made a mistake, but Judith's vindictive pursuit of these charges has caused more damage than anything that happened at that party. She should be ashamed of herself." Hearing my own parents blame me for reporting my brother's attempt to assault me was a level of betrayal I hadn't thought possible. David had to physically restrain himself from standing up in the courtroom, his face flushed with anger at their words. Marius received a sentence of 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. The judge spoke directly to him during sentencing, noting that his actions represented a profound betrayal of trust, and that his lack of remorse during the trial had influenced the length of his sentence. "You plan to drug and assault your own sister," the judge said. "This was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a premeditated crime that required extensive planning and preparation. The fact that your wife became the victim instead doesn't minimize the severity of your intentions." When Marius was led away in handcuffs, my parents sobbed like they were watching an innocent man being railroaded, completely unable to accept that their son was exactly where he belonged. The aftermath of the trial brought a strange kind of peace mixed with profound loss. Marius was in prison where he couldn't hurt anyone else, and I was finally safe from his manipulation and schemes. But I'd also lost my parents and most of my extended family, people who chose loyalty to a criminal over justice for his victim. The holidays that first year were particularly difficult, spent with just David and me instead of the large family gatherings I'd known all my life. We flew to Montana to visit David's family instead, where his parents welcomed me with warmth and acceptance that helped heal some of the wounds my own family had inflicted. "You did the right thing," David's mother told me, as we sat by their fireplace on Christmas Eve. "It took courage to stand up to him, and even more courage to follow through when your own family turned against you. We're proud of you." Rebuilding my life without my birth family was harder than I'd expected, but it also opened space for relationships that were healthier and more authentic. David and I grew even closer through the crisis, his unwavering support showing me what real partnership looked like. We started going to couples therapy, not because we were having problems, but because we wanted to make sure the trauma didn't damage our relationship. The therapist helped us process what had happened and develop strategies for dealing with the ongoing stress of family estrangement. Some of my friendships deepened as people who might have been casual acquaintances before stepped up to offer real support. My coworkers rallied around me, bringing meals and sending cards during the worst of the legal proceedings. I discovered that chosen family could be just as powerful as blood relatives, sometimes more so because the relationships were based on respect and care rather than obligation. About 18 months after the trial, I received an unexpected phone call from Jennifer. She'd been seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery and had worked through much of her own healing process. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for switching those drinks, for probably saving my life, but also for having the courage to see this through to the end. You know it cost you your family, and I'm sorry about that, but you stopped him from hurting other people." She told me she'd discovered during the divorce proceedings that Marius had a pattern of controlling and manipulative behavior that she'd rationalized or ignored during their marriage. "I think I would have been his victim eventually anyway," she said. "You just accelerated the timeline and probably prevented worse things from happening." Her gratitude meant more to me than she could know, validation that the sacrifice had been worth it. My relationship with my parents remained completely severed, despite a few awkward attempts by extended family members to broker reconciliation. They made it clear that any relationship with them would require me to recant my testimony and publicly admit I'd lied about Marius's actions. Since that was impossible, both morally and legally, we remained estranged. I heard through the family grapevine that they visited Marius regularly in prison, still maintaining his innocence and planning for his eventual release. They'd turned him into a martyr in their minds, a good man destroyed by his vengeful sister, rather than accept the reality of what he'd done. That level of denial was painful but also liberating. It freed me from any obligation to maintain relationships with people who could choose a criminal over his victim simply because he was their blood. The legal victory also had practical consequences that extended beyond emotional healing. Marius lost his real estate license, his business collapsed, and he faced significant civil liability for Jennifer's medical expenses and emotional damages. The house in Lake Oswego had to be sold to pay legal fees and settlements, with Jennifer receiving the majority of the proceeds as part of their divorce agreement. Marius's carefully constructed image as a successful businessman was completely destroyed, replaced by the reality of who he'd always been underneath the charm and manipulation. When he was eventually released from prison, he'd be returning to a world where everyone knew exactly what he was capable of, making it much harder for him to victimize others. 3 years later, David and I got married in a small ceremony in his hometown, surrounded by people who loved and supported us genuinely. My grandmother was the only member of my birth family who attended, walking me down the aisle with tears of pride in her eyes. "Your parents are fools," she whispered as she placed my hand in David's. "But their loss is your gain. You've built something beautiful here." The wedding was intimate and meaningful in ways that wouldn't have been possible with the toxic family dynamics I'd left behind. Instead of navigating politics and keeping peace between feuding relatives, we were surrounded by people who were genuinely happy for us and excited to celebrate our love. David's best man spoke about the courage it took to stand up for what's right even when it costs you everything, and I knew he was talking about more than just our relationship. Looking back now, I can see that the anniversary party was the night my real life began. Not because trauma is good or necessary, but because sometimes crisis reveals who people really are underneath their carefully constructed facades. Marius showed himself to be capable of planning and executing an assault on his own sister. My parents showed themselves to be more invested in maintaining appearances than protecting their child from harm. But I also showed myself that I was capable of recognizing danger, acting decisively to protect myself, and following through with consequences even when it meant losing everything familiar. David showed himself to be exactly the partner I'd hoped he was, someone who would stand with me against the whole world if necessary. The relationships I've built since then are based on mutual respect, honesty, and genuine care rather than obligation or fear. When friends disagree with me now, we work through it with healthy communication. When David and I have conflicts, we address them directly instead of walking on eggshells or avoiding difficult conversations. I've learned to trust my instincts about people and situations, to speak up when something feels wrong, and to prioritize my safety and well-being over other people's comfort. These might seem like basic life skills, but they were revolutionary for someone who'd been trained from childhood to keep peace at any cost and never make waves that might upset the family dynamic. The most important lesson I learned is that family isn't just about blood, it's about who shows up for you when everything falls apart. David's family embraced me completely, treating me like the daughter they'd always wanted rather than an outsider they had to tolerate. My chosen family of friends and colleagues has been more supportive and loving than my birth family ever was, even before the crisis. The people who matter most are the ones who love you because of who you are, not despite it, and who want you to be safe and happy even when it's inconvenient for them. Blood relatives who demand loyalty to people who hurt you aren't really family at all, they're just people who share your DNA and happen to have expectations about your behavior. If you're dealing with something similar, family members who prioritize keeping peace over keeping you safe, people who ask you to minimize your own trauma to protect someone else's reputation, relatives who choose the abuser over the victim because it's easier, I want you to know that you're not crazy, you're not overreacting, and you don't owe anyone access to your life just because you're related to them. Trust your instincts about what feels wrong. Document everything you can. Build relationships with people who believe you and support you, and remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who can't or won't love you the way you deserve. The warning signs were there long before that anniversary party, but I'd been trained to ignore them in service of family harmony. Marius's entitlement, his subtle cruelty, his need to control and dominate others, these weren't new developments that emerged suddenly. They were patterns that had been established for years, normalized by a family system that prioritized his comfort over everyone else's well-being. My parents' favoritism wasn't just preferential treatment, it was active enablement of behavior that should have been corrected early and often. When family members consistently prioritize one person's wants over another person's safety, they're creating conditions where abuse becomes inevitable. Looking for these patterns in your own relationships isn't about being paranoid or suspicious, it's about being realistic about human nature and protecting yourself from people who haven't learned healthy boundaries. Pay attention to how people treat service workers, how they handle being told no, how they react when they don't get their way immediately. Notice who takes responsibility for their mistakes and who always has someone else to blame. Watch for people who use guilt, obligation, fear, or shame to control others' behavior. These are the tools that abusers use, and they don't suddenly develop them overnight. But also notice the people who consistently show up for you without being asked, who remember things that matter to you, who respect your boundaries even when they don't understand them. Pay attention to who makes you feel safe to be yourself, who celebrates your successes without making it about them, who supports your growth even when it means you might change in ways they don't prefer. These are the people worth investing in, worth prioritizing, worth calling family regardless of whether you share blood with them. If you're currently dealing with family pressure to maintain relationships with people who've hurt you, remember that forgiveness and reconciliation aren't the same thing. You can forgive someone for your own peace of mind without giving them access to hurt you again. You can wish someone well from a distance without including them in your daily life. You can love someone and still recognize that they're not safe for you to be around. Healthy relationships require mutual respect, accountability, and the ability to change harmful patterns. When those elements are missing, the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to create distance. The process of rebuilding your life after cutting ties with toxic family members is challenging but ultimately liberating. You'll probably grieve the family you thought you had, the relationships you hoped were possible, the belonging you wanted to feel. And that grief is normal and necessary. Let yourself feel it fully. But you'll also discover freedoms you never knew you were missing. The freedom to speak honestly about your experiences, to prioritize your own well-being, to build relationships based on mutual care rather than fearful obligation. You'll find that people who truly love you will understand why you made the choices you did, and those who don't understand probably weren't safe relationships anyway. I won't lie and say it was easy or that I don't sometimes miss what I thought my family could have been. Holidays can still be bittersweet, and there are moments when I wish I could share good news with my parents without worrying about their reaction. But the peace I've found in authentic relationships, the safety I feel in my daily life, and the confidence I've developed in my own judgment are worth more than any family gathering or surface-level harmony. I sleep well at night knowing that everyone in my life chooses to be there, and that I never have to wonder whether someone who claims to love me is actually planning to hurt me. If you're watching this and recognizing your own story in mine, please know that you're not alone, you're not overreacting, and you deserve relationships that make you feel valued and protected. Trust your instincts, document what you can, build your support network, and don't let anyone convince you that family loyalty requires accepting abuse. The people who are meant to be in your life will stand with you when you protect yourself, not against you. Thank you for watching, and please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and whether this story resonated with your own experiences. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about finding your real family and building the life you actually want, not just the one you inherited. Remember that you're worth protecting, you're worth believing, and you're worth fighting for, even if the people who should have taught you that failed to do their job. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.